Deep in the heart of Africa, along the life-giving waters of the Nile, there once flourished a civilization so powerful that it conquered and ruled over Egypt itself. Yet today, most people have never heard their name. While the pharaohs of Egypt capture our imagination with their golden masks and towering monuments, their southern neighbors remain shrouded in mystery, their incredible achievements buried beneath centuries of neglect and oversight. These were the Kushites, and their story is one of the most remarkable tales of power, resilience, and cultural brilliance that the ancient world has to offer. For over 14 centuries, this African kingdom dominated the Upper Nile, challenging empires, trading with distant lands, and creating some of the most spectacular monuments ever built. They were master archers whose skills were legendary throughout the Mediterranean world. They were brilliant metalworkers who crafted gold and iron into works of art. Most remarkably of all, they were ruled by warrior queens whose power and authority were unmatched in the ancient world. The Kingdom of Kush represents something extraordinary in human history. Here was a civilization that not only survived alongside the mighty Egyptian empire, but eventually surpassed it, conquering the land of the pharaohs and establishing their own dynasty on the throne of Egypt. Their kings became pharaohs, their queens wielded unprecedented power, and their armies struck fear into the hearts of enemies from Rome to Mesopotamia. But who exactly were these enigmatic people? How did a kingdom south of Egypt rise to become one of the most formidable powers of the ancient world? What secrets lie buried in their spectacular pyramids, and why have their incredible achievements been so thoroughly forgotten by history? Today, we embark on a journey to uncover the truth about one of Africa's greatest civilizations, exploring their origins, their conquests, and their lasting legacy on the ancient world. The story of the Kushites begins in the harsh and unforgiving landscape of Nubia, a region stretching along the Nile River through what is now southern Egypt and northern Sudan. This was a land of extremes, where the life-giving waters of the Nile carved a narrow green corridor through endless expanses of desert. Here, among the granite outcroppings and golden sands, the earliest Nubian peoples established settlements that would eventually grow into one of history's most powerful kingdoms. The origins of Kushite civilization can be traced back over 4,000 years, to around 2,400 BCE, when the first organized state emerged in this region. The ancient city of Kerma became the focal point of this early civilization, growing into a major center of trade and culture that would challenge Egyptian dominance for centuries. The Egyptians themselves recognized the importance of this southern neighbor, referring to the region as Kush, likely derived from the indigenous term Kasu. From these humble beginnings, the relationship between Egypt and Kush would define much of ancient African history. It was a relationship built on trade, warfare, cultural exchange, and mutual respect, though neither civilization would hesitate to dominate the other when opportunity arose. The Egyptians established trading posts and fortifications along the Nile, seeking to control the flow of exotic goods from the African interior. Gold, ivory, ebony, and precious stones flowed northward, while Egyptian manufactured goods, ideas, and technologies moved south. Yet the Kushites were far from passive recipients of Egyptian influence. They were active participants in this cultural exchange, adapting what served their purposes while maintaining their own distinct identity. They developed their own artistic styles, their own religious practices, and their own political systems that would eventually prove more enduring than those of their northern neighbors. The early Kingdom of Kush established itself as a formidable military power, with warriors whose skills became legendary throughout the ancient world. The region earned the Egyptian designation Ta-Siti, meaning the land of the bow, in recognition of the extraordinary archery abilities of Kushite warriors. These were not ordinary bowmen, but master archers who wielded bows that stretched 6 to 7 feet in length, requiring such tremendous strength that many warriors used their feet to bend their weapons. The construction and use of these massive bows required not only physical prowess, but also remarkable technical skill. Kushite archers favoured one-piece bows carved from seasoned palm wood, creating weapons of incredible power and accuracy. Their arrows, crafted from cane and often tipped with poison, could penetrate armour and strike targets at distances that amazed contemporary observers. Greek historian Herodotus, writing centuries later, would document the fearsome reputation of these warriors whose archery skills were unmatched in the ancient world. This military prowess was not merely for show. The Kushites used their superior archery to defend their territory, expand their influence, and eventually challenge the mightiest powers of their age. Their armies became the backbone of a kingdom that would endure for over a millennium, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining their military edge through constant innovation and training. The strategic location of the Kingdom of Kush proved to be one of its greatest assets. Positioned at the crossroads between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean world, Kush became a crucial intermediary for trade in exotic goods that were highly prized throughout the ancient world. Caravans carrying ivory from the African interior, incense from distant lands, and precious stones from hidden mines all passed through Kushite territory, bringing wealth and international connections to the kingdom. This geographic advantage extended far beyond simple trade routes. The Nile River provided a natural highway for commerce and communication, while the surrounding deserts offered protection from invasion. The kingdom controlled the river valleys and oases that were essential for long-distance travel, allowing Kushite rulers to levy tolls on passing merchants and accumulate the wealth necessary to build their spectacular monuments and maintain their powerful armies. The natural resources of the region further enhanced Kushite prosperity. The land was rich in gold deposits that would become legendary throughout the ancient world. Iron ore was abundant, allowing Kushite metalworkers to develop advanced techniques for creating weapons, tools, and artistic objects that were prized far beyond their borders. The fertile soils along the Nile supported agriculture that could feed large populations, while the surrounding lands provided grazing for the cattle that were central to Kushite culture and economy. Perhaps most importantly, the Kingdom of Kush developed a unique approach to governance that would prove remarkably stable and enduring. Unlike many ancient civilizations that were built around the absolute power of male monarchs, Kushite society evolved to embrace female leadership in ways that were unprecedented in the ancient world. Queens and queen mothers wielded real political power, commanding armies, conducting diplomatic negotiations, and ruling in their own right rather than merely as consorts or regents. This distinctive approach to leadership would become one of the most remarkable features of Kushite civilization. During certain periods of their history, women would dominate the political landscape to such an extent that the kingdom became famous throughout the ancient world for its powerful queens. These were not ceremonial figureheads, but active rulers who led armies into battle, negotiated with foreign powers, and shaped the destiny of their people through decisive action and political acumen. The religious life of the Kushites reflected their position at the cultural crossroads of Africa and the Mediterranean. They developed a sophisticated theological system that blended indigenous African beliefs with influences from Egypt and other neighbouring civilizations. The result was a rich and complex religious tradition that honoured both local deities and adopted gods from other cultures, creating a pantheon that reflected the diverse influences that shaped Kushite society. Central to Kushite religious practice was the worship of Amun, a deity they shared with the Egyptians but interpreted through their own cultural lens. The great temple complex at Jebel Barkal became one of the most sacred sites in the kingdom, a place where earthly and divine power converged in spectacular architectural displays that impressed visitors from across the known world. Here, Kushite kings and queens performed the rituals that legitimized their rule and connected them to the cosmic forces that governed human destiny. Yet alongside these borrowed deities, the Kushites maintained their own indigenous religious traditions. Local gods like Apedamak, the lion-headed protector deity, held positions of honor in the Kushite pantheon. These native divinities represented the unique cultural identity that the Kushites maintained, even as they engaged with the wider world of ancient civilizations. The artistic achievements of the Kingdom of Kush reflected this same blend of influences and indigenous creativity. Kushite artisans mastered the techniques of their Egyptian neighbors while developing their own distinctive styles and themes. Their sculptures, paintings, and decorative objects displayed a sophistication and technical skill that rivaled the greatest artistic centers of the ancient world. The most spectacular expressions of Kushite artistic achievement were their monumental constructions. The kingdom became famous for its pyramid-building traditions, ultimately constructing more pyramids than Egypt itself. These were not mere copies of Egyptian monuments, but distinctively Kushite creations that reflected their own architectural preferences and religious beliefs. The pyramids of Kush displayed the technical mastery and aesthetic sensibilities that characterized the kingdom's approach to monumental architecture. Built with steep sides and precise angles, these structures required advanced mathematical knowledge and engineering skills that demonstrated the high level of learning and technical expertise that flourished in Kushite society. As we delve deeper into the remarkable story of the Kushites, we begin to understand why this civilization deserves to be remembered alongside the greatest powers of the ancient world. Here was a kingdom that successfully balanced tradition and innovation, military power and cultural achievement, local identity and international engagement. The Kushites created a civilization that would endure for over 14 centuries, leaving behind monuments and achievements that continue to astound modern archaeologists and historians. Their story challenges our assumptions about ancient Africa and reveals the complexity and sophistication of civilizations that have been overlooked by traditional historical narratives. The Kingdom of Kush was not a peripheral civilization existing in the shadow of more famous neighbors, but a major power that shaped the course of ancient history through its military conquests, cultural achievements, and political innovations. In the episodes to come, we will explore how this remarkable kingdom rose to dominate the Nile Valley, conquered Egypt itself, and established one of the most fascinating dynasties in ancient history. We will meet the warrior queens who defied Rome, the kings who became pharaohs, and the artists and builders who created monuments that still inspire wonder today. The story of the Kushites is far from over, and their greatest achievements still lie ahead in our journey through the annals of this extraordinary civilization. But the true test of Kushite greatness would come not through peaceful trade or artistic achievement, but through the crucible of war and conquest. By the 8th century BCE, Egypt found itself weakened by internal strife and political fragmentation. The once mighty kingdom of the pharaohs had splintered into competing dynasties, each claiming legitimacy, while the nation's power crumbled from within. It was into this vacuum that the Kushites would step, seizing an opportunity that would transform them from regional power to masters of the ancient world's greatest civilization. The man who would lead this audacious conquest was King Piye, a ruler whose military genius and political acumen would earn him a place among history's greatest conquerors. Unlike many ancient kings who inherited stable kingdoms, Piye faced the monumental challenge of uniting a fractured Egypt under Kushite rule while maintaining control over his own expanding domain. His campaign would require not just military skill, but diplomatic finesse, as he sought to present himself not as a foreign invader, but as the rightful restorer of Egyptian greatness. Piye's invasion of Egypt around 747 BCE marked the beginning of one of the most remarkable periods in ancient African history. His armies, led by the legendary Kushite archers and supported by cavalry and infantry trained in the harsh deserts of Nubia, swept northward along the Nile with a precision and efficiency that stunned contemporary observers. City after city fell to the Kushite advance, not merely through brute force, but through careful planning and strategic brilliance that demonstrated the sophisticated military thinking of Kushite commanders. What made Paye's conquest truly extraordinary was not just his military success, but his approach to ruling the conquered territories. Rather than imposing Kushite culture and customs upon the Egyptians, he embraced Egyptian traditions while infusing them with Kushite innovations. He restored ancient temples that had fallen into disrepair, revived religious ceremonies that had been neglected, and presented himself as a pharaoh in the classical Egyptian tradition, while maintaining his identity as a Kushite king. The establishment of the 25th dynasty marked the beginning of what historians now call the era of the Black Pharaohs, a period when Kushite rulers controlled both Egypt and Nubia, creating an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the heart of Africa. These pharaohs brought stability to an Egypt that had suffered through decades of civil war and foreign intervention, ushering in a renaissance of art, architecture, and religious devotion that recalled the greatest periods of Egyptian history. Under Kushite rule, Egypt experienced a cultural revival that touched every aspect of society. Ancient artistic traditions were revived and refined, temple construction resumed on a grand scale, and trade networks that had withered during the periods of instability were restored and expanded. The Kushite pharaohs proved themselves worthy successors to the great rulers of Egypt's past, combining respect for tradition with innovative approaches that reflected their unique cultural perspective. The most famous of these black pharaohs was Taharqa, whose reign from 690 to 664 BCE represented the pinnacle of Kushite power and achievement. Taharqa was not merely a successful military commander, but a patron of the arts and architecture, whose building projects rivaled those of the most celebrated pharaohs of Egyptian history. His restoration of the temple complex at Karnak demonstrated both his reverence for Egyptian tradition and his commitment to maintaining the religious foundations that legitimized pharaonic rule. Yet Taharqa's greatest achievements extended far beyond Egypt's borders. He initiated massive construction projects throughout Kushite territory, building temples and monuments that showcase the wealth and power of his empire. His pyramids at Nuri represented a synthesis of Egyptian and Kushite architectural traditions, creating monuments that were distinctly African while honoring the cultural heritage of both civilizations. The religious policies of the Kushite pharaohs revealed the sophisticated approach these rulers took to governing their diverse empire. They understood that successful rule required more than military conquest. It demanded cultural legitimacy and religious authority. The Kushite pharaohs became high priests of the Egyptian pantheon, while maintaining their roles as guardians of Kushite religious traditions. This dual identity allowed them to command loyalty from both Egyptian and Kushite populations, creating a stable foundation for their extended empire. The role of women in Kushite royal administration became even more pronounced during the period of Egyptian rule. Kushite princesses were appointed to the prestigious position of God's wife of Amun at Thebes, effectively controlling one of Egypt's most important religious centers. These appointments were not merely ceremonial, but represented real political power, as the God's wife of Amun controlled vast temple estates and wielded significant influence over religious and political affairs throughout Upper Egypt. The economic implications of Kushite rule over Egypt were transformative for both civilizations. The combined resources of the Nile Valley, from the Mediterranean to the cataracts of Nubia, created an economic powerhouse that could compete with any empire of the ancient world. Gold from Kushite mines, agricultural surplus from Egyptian fields, and trade goods flowing through both territories generated wealth on a scale that few ancient rulers could imagine. This economic integration facilitated cultural exchange that enriched both civilizations. Egyptian artistic techniques influenced Kushite craftsmen, while Kushite innovations in metallurgy and military technology spread throughout Egypt. The result was a flowering of cultural achievement that demonstrated the benefits of political unity and cultural exchange between neighboring civilizations. However, The rise of Kushite power did not go unnoticed by other major powers of the ancient world. The Assyrian Empire, expanding westward from Mesopotamia, viewed the Kushite control of Egypt as a direct threat to their own imperial ambitions. The wealth and strategic importance of Egypt made it a prize that the Assyrians could not ignore, setting the stage for a confrontation that would test the military might of both empires. The conflict between Kush and Assyria represented a clash between two of the ancient world's most formidable military powers. The Assyrians had built their empire through innovative siege warfare and disciplined infantry formations, while the Kushites relied on their superior archery skills and knowledge of desert warfare. When these two military systems collided, the result would reshape the balance of power throughout the ancient Near East. The first major confrontation came during Taharka's reign, when Assyrian forces under Esarhaddon invaded Egypt with the explicit goal of driving out the Kushite pharaohs. The campaign revealed both the strengths and limitations of Kushite military power. While Kushite forces could match the Assyrians in open battle, they struggled against the sophisticated siege techniques that the Assyrians had perfected through centuries of warfare. The siege of Memphis in 671 BCE marked a turning point in the conflict. Despite fierce Kushite resistance, the city fell to the Assyrians, forcing Taharka to retreat southward. Yet this was far from the end of Kushite resistance. Taharka regrouped his forces and launched a counterattack that temporarily drove the Assyrians from Egypt, demonstrating the resilience and tactical flexibility that characterized Kushite military leadership. The back-and-forth nature of this conflict illustrated the relatively equal strength of the two powers. Neither the Kushites nor the Assyrians could achieve a decisive victory that would permanently settle the question of Egyptian control. This military stalemate created opportunities for Egyptian rulers to play the two powers against each other, seeking to restore native Egyptian rule while the foreign powers exhausted themselves in prolonged warfare. The final phase of Kushite rule in Egypt came during the reign of Taharka's successor, Tantamani, who made one last attempt to restore Kushite control over the entire Nile Valley. His initial successes, including the recapture of Memphis, seemed to herald a Kushite renaissance. However, the Assyrian response under Ashurbanipal proved overwhelming, driving Kushite forces permanently from Egypt and ending the era of the Black Pharaohs. Yet the end of Kushite rule in Egypt did not mark the decline of the Kingdom of Kush itself. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new chapter in Kushite history, as the rulers retreated southward to their traditional heartland and began the process of creating a distinctly Kushite civilization that would endure for another 1,000 years. The lessons learned from ruling Egypt, the wealth accumulated during the conquest period, and the cultural achievements of the 25th dynasty would all contribute to this remarkable transformation. The retreat from Egypt forced the Kushites to relocate their capital from Napata to the more secure city of Meroe, deep in the Sudanese heartland. This strategic withdrawal allowed them to maintain their independence while adapting to changed circumstances. The move to Meroe would prove to be one of the most important decisions in Kushite history, creating the foundation for a golden age of cultural and economic achievement that would make the later Kushite kingdom one of the most prosperous and sophisticated civilizations of the ancient world. Here, at Obscure Histories, we understand that the story of the Kushites challenges everything we thought we knew about ancient Africa and the distribution of power in the ancient world. The image of African warriors conquering Egypt and ruling as pharaohs contradicts centuries of historical narratives that marginalized African achievements. Yet, the archaeological evidence is overwhelming, the historical records are clear, and the monuments still stand as testimony to one of history's most remarkable success stories. The transformation of Kush from Egyptian province to Egyptian conqueror to independent kingdom represents one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in ancient history. It demonstrates the importance of military innovation, political flexibility, and cultural adaptation in determining the rise and fall of civilizations. Most importantly, It reveals the agency and achievement of African peoples in shaping the course of world history through their own actions and decisions. As we continue our exploration of this extraordinary civilization, we will discover how the Kushites used their retreat from Egypt as an opportunity for reinvention and renewal. The kingdom that emerged from this period of challenge and change would become even more remarkable than the one that had conquered the pharaohs, developing innovations in government, technology, and culture that would influence civilizations throughout Africa and beyond. The relocation to Meroe around 590 BCE would prove to be a masterstroke of strategic thinking that transformed the Kingdom of Kush into something entirely new and unprecedented. Far from being a retreat born of defeat, the move south represented a calculated decision to build upon centuries of accumulated knowledge, wealth, and cultural sophistication. The new capital offered advantages that Napata could never provide, positioning the Kushites to exploit resources and trade networks that would make them more prosperous than they had ever been during their Egyptian conquests. Meroe's location was nothing short of brilliant from both defensive and economic perspectives. Situated between the Blue and White Nile rivers, the city controlled the confluence of two of Africa's most important waterways, while remaining far enough south to discourage invasion by Mediterranean powers. The surrounding region was blessed with abundant rainfall that made agriculture more reliable than in the northern territories, while vast deposits of iron ore provided the raw materials for what would become one of the ancient world's most advanced metallurgical industries. The iron industry that developed around Meroe transformed not just the Kushite economy, but the entire character of African civilization. Archaeological excavations have revealed massive slag heaps that testify to centuries of intensive iron production, earning Meroe the designation as the Birmingham of ancient Africa. Kushite metalworkers developed techniques for smelting and forging that were among the most sophisticated in the ancient world, producing tools, weapons, and artistic objects that were prized throughout the known world. This technological mastery extended far beyond simple iron production. Kushite craftsmen became renowned for their gold-working skills, creating jewelry and decorative objects of extraordinary beauty and technical sophistication. The combination of abundant raw materials, advanced techniques, and artistic vision produced luxury goods that found markets from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, generating the wealth that would finance Meroe's golden age of architectural and cultural achievement. The agricultural revolution that accompanied the move to Meroe was equally transformative. The reliable rainfall and fertile soils of the region supported crops that had been difficult to cultivate in the more arid northern territories. Cotton cultivation became particularly important, providing the raw material for textile production that would become another cornerstone of the Meroitic economy. The ability to produce high-quality textiles gave the Kushites yet another export commodity that was highly valued in international markets. The political innovations that emerged during the Meroitic period represented perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this cultural renaissance. The system of government that developed around the new capital elevated female leadership to levels that were unprecedented in the ancient world. The institution of the Candace, or Queen Mother, evolved from a ceremonial position into one of real political authority, with some Candaces ruling as independent monarchs with full sovereign power. This political transformation reflected deeper changes in Kushite society that set them apart from virtually every other civilization of their era. While most ancient societies relegated women to subordinate roles, the Kushites developed a system that recognized female political authority as legitimate and necessary. The reasons for this unique development remain debated by scholars, but the results were unmistakable in their impact on Kushite society and governance. The most famous of these royal women was Queen Amanirenas, whose confrontation with Rome would become one of the most celebrated military campaigns in ancient African history. When Roman forces under Augustus attempted to extend their control southward from Egypt, they encountered a Kushite military response that was both swift and devastating. Amanirenas led her armies in a 3-year war that not only repelled Roman expansion, but actually pushed Roman forces back and captured significant territory. The conflict with Rome revealed the continued military effectiveness of Kushite forces even after their withdrawal from Egypt. Amanirenas commanded an army of 30,000 warriors who demonstrated the same archery skills and tactical sophistication that had made their ancestors feared throughout the Mediterranean world. The war culminated in the sack of Aswan and the capture of Roman military standards, trophies that were displayed in Meroe as symbols of Kushite victory over the world's most powerful empire. The psychological impact of this victory extended far beyond its military significance. Here was an African queen leading her people to victory against the Romans at the very height of their power, demonstrating that the Kushites remained a force to be reckoned with, despite their withdrawal from Egypt. The bronze head of Augustus, discovered buried in front of a Meroitic temple, serves as a powerful symbol of this triumph, representing the literal and figurative defeat of Roman imperial pretensions in Africa. The diplomatic resolution of the conflict proved equally impressive, as Amanirenas negotiated a treaty that recognized Kushite sovereignty and established clear boundaries between Roman and Kushite territories. The agreement demonstrated the diplomatic sophistication of Kushite leadership and their ability to engage with major powers as equals, rather than subordinates. This diplomatic success ensured that Meroe would remain independent and prosperous for centuries to come. The cultural flowering that accompanied these political and military successes transformed Meroe into one of the ancient world's great centers of learning and artistic achievement. The city became home to a cosmopolitan population that included merchants, craftsmen, scholars, and artists from across Africa and the Mediterranean world. This diversity of population and perspective contributed to innovations in art, architecture, and technology that reflected the best of multiple cultural traditions. The religious life of Meroitic Kush evolved to reflect this cultural sophistication and independence. While maintaining connections to Egyptian religious traditions, the Kushites developed their own distinctive theological system centered around indigenous African deities. Apedamak, the lion-headed god of war and protection, emerged as one of the most important figures in the Meroitic pantheon, representing the fierce independence and military prowess that characterized the kingdom. The temples dedicated to Apedamak and other Kushite deities represented architectural innovations that departed significantly from Egyptian models. These structures incorporated design elements that were distinctly African while demonstrating technical mastery that rivaled the greatest architectural achievements of the ancient world. The Lion Temple at Naka stands as perhaps the finest example of this synthesis, combining classical proportions with uniquely Kushite decorative elements. The development of the Meroitic script during this period represented another crucial step in the evolution of an independent Kushite identity. While earlier Kushite rulers had relied on Egyptian hieroglyphs for official inscriptions, the creation of their own writing system demonstrated both linguistic independence and administrative sophistication. The Meroitic script, derived from Egyptian writing but adapted to represent the Kushite language, was used for everything from royal chronicles to commercial records and religious texts. This linguistic innovation had profound implications for Kushite culture and identity. The ability to record their own language in their own script allowed the Kushites to preserve and transmit cultural knowledge in ways that had previously been impossible. Royal inscriptions, religious texts, and historical chronicles could now be written in the language of the people rather than in the foreign tongue of their former Egyptian overlords. The economic prosperity of Meroitic Kush created opportunities for architectural projects that rivaled the greatest monuments of any ancient civilization. The pyramid complexes at Meroe represented the culmination of centuries of architectural evolution, combining Egyptian influences with distinctly Kushite innovations. These structures were not mere copies of Egyptian monuments, but original creations that reflected the unique aesthetic sensibilities and technical capabilities of Meroitic builders. The royal necropolis at Meroe eventually contained more than 200 pyramids, making it one of the largest pyramid complexes ever constructed. The variety of sizes and decorative schemes represented different periods of construction and reflected the individual preferences of the rulers who commissioned them. Some pyramids were decorated with elaborate relief carvings that depicted scenes from Kushite mythology and royal ceremonies, while others featured architectural elements that had no precedent in Egyptian tradition. Here at Obscure Histories, we find ourselves constantly amazed by the sophistication and originality of Meroitic achievements. The transformation of Kush from a kingdom that had once borrowed heavily from Egyptian models into a civilization that created its own distinctive cultural forms represents one of the most remarkable examples of cultural independence and innovation in ancient history. The Kushites proved that adaptation and borrowing could serve as stepping stones to original achievement rather than permanent dependence. The urban planning of Meroe itself reflected this same spirit of innovation and sophistication. The city was laid out according to principles that balanced practical considerations with aesthetic and symbolic concerns. Wide avenues connected major temple complexes and royal palaces, while residential districts were organized according to social status and occupational specialization. The result was a city that functioned efficiently while projecting an image of power and prosperity that impressed visitors from across the known world. The palace complexes that dominated the city centre represented architectural achievements that combined practical functionality with symbolic grandeur. These structures housed not only the royal family, but also the administrative apparatus that governed the kingdom and the religious establishment that maintained the spiritual foundations of royal authority. The integration of residential, administrative, and religious functions within unified architectural complexes demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of governance and symbolism that characterized Meroitic political culture. The international connections that Meroe maintained during its golden age extended far beyond the traditional trade networks of the Nile Valley. Archaeological evidence suggests regular contact with civilizations as distant as India and China, indicating that the Kushites had developed commercial relationships that spanned continents. These connections brought exotic goods and new ideas to Meroe, while carrying Kushite products and cultural influences to distant lands. The discovery of Chinese silk, Indian spices, and Roman glassware in Meroitic archaeological contexts reveals the extent of these international connections. The Kushites were not isolated in their African homeland, but active participants in the global economy of the ancient world. Their strategic location at the crossroads of Africa and the Mediterranean world made them natural intermediaries for long-distance trade, while their reputation for producing high-quality goods ensured steady demand for Kushite exports. The administrative systems that governed this complex economy demonstrated remarkable sophistication and efficiency. Royal officials oversaw everything from tax collection to trade regulation, ensuring that the benefits of economic prosperity were channeled toward projects that enhanced the kingdom's power and prestige. The ability to coordinate large-scale construction projects, maintain professional armies, and support extensive religious establishments required administrative capabilities that matched those of any ancient civilization. The military organization of Meroitic Kush evolved to meet the challenges of defending an extensive territory while maintaining the offensive capabilities necessary for projecting power beyond their borders. The traditional emphasis on archery remained central to Kushite military doctrine, but new weapons and tactics were incorporated to address changing strategic requirements. The integration of cavalry, infantry, and specialized units created a military force that could adapt to different types of warfare while maintaining the core advantages that had made Kushite armies feared throughout the ancient world. The training and equipment of Meroitic warriors reflected the kingdom's prosperity and technological sophistication. Archaeological discoveries have revealed weapons and armor of exceptional quality, demonstrating the advanced metallurgical skills that characterized Kushite craftsmanship. The combination of superior equipment, rigorous training, and tactical innovation created military forces that could compete successfully with any army of their era. The legacy of this military tradition extended far beyond the immediate needs of territorial defense. The reputation of Kushite warriors as elite fighters created opportunities for military service in foreign armies, generating both income and international influence for the kingdom. Kushite mercenaries served in armies throughout the Mediterranean world, carrying their military skills and cultural influences to distant lands while maintaining connections to their homeland. The educational systems that supported these military, administrative, and commercial achievements required institutions capable of training specialists in a wide variety of fields. The existence of schools and academies in Meroe is suggested by the sophisticated knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and engineering that Kushite achievements required. The ability to design and construct complex architectural projects, navigate international trade networks, and maintain diplomatic relations with distant powers demanded educational institutions capable of producing highly trained professionals. The intellectual achievements of Meroitic scholars extended beyond purely practical concerns to encompass areas of theoretical knowledge that demonstrated the depth and breadth of Kushite learning. Astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, and medical knowledge all reached levels of sophistication that compared favorably with the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world. The synthesis of knowledge from multiple cultural traditions created intellectual innovations that contributed to the advancement of human understanding. As we delve deeper into the remarkable achievements of Meroitic Kush, we begin to appreciate the full magnitude of what this civilization accomplished during its golden age. The transformation from Egyptian satellite to independent cultural innovator represents one of the most successful examples of civilizational adaptation and renewal in human history. The Kushites demonstrated that political setbacks could be converted into opportunities for growth, and that cultural borrowing could serve as the foundation for original achievement. The story of Meroitic Kush challenges conventional narratives about ancient Africa and demonstrates the importance of recognizing African achievements on their own terms, rather than simply as footnotes to Mediterranean or Middle Eastern history. The sophistication of Kushite government, the prosperity of their economy, the beauty of their art, and the power of their military all testify to the remarkable capabilities of this African civilization. Yet even as we celebrate these achievements, we must remember that the story of the Kushites is far from complete. The golden age of Meroe would eventually face challenges that would test the resilience and adaptability that had carried the kingdom through previous crises. The rise of new powers, changes in trade routes, and internal developments would all contribute to transformations that would reshape the character of Kushite civilization once again. The religious innovations that emerged during the height of Meroitic power represented far more than simple theological evolution. They reflected a civilization confident enough in its own identity to forge new spiritual paths while honoring ancient traditions. The temples that rose throughout the kingdom during this period were not mere copies of Egyptian or Mediterranean models, but original expressions of Kushite religious vision, incorporating architectural elements and decorative motifs that had never been seen before in the ancient world. The priesthood that served these temples developed into one of the most sophisticated religious establishments of antiquity. These were not simply ceremonial figures, but learned scholars who maintained extensive libraries, conducted complex rituals, and served as advisors to the royal court on matters both spiritual and temporal. The integration of religious and political authority that characterized Meroitic governance required religious leaders who could navigate the complexities of both divine and earthly power with equal skill. The festival calendar that governed Meroitic religious life reveals the complexity and richness of Kushite spiritual practices. Throughout the year, elaborate ceremonies marked the changing seasons, celebrated military victories, and honored the ancestors who had built the kingdom's greatness. These events were not merely religious observances, but occasions for displaying the wealth and power of the royal court. strengthening social bonds between different groups within the kingdom, and reinforcing the cultural identity that distinguished the Kushites from their neighbours. The artistic traditions that flourished during these religious celebrations produced some of the most spectacular examples of Kushite creativity. Ceremonial objects crafted from gold, silver, and precious stones demonstrated technical mastery that rivaled the finest work produced anywhere in the ancient world. The combination of indigenous African artistic motifs with influences from Egypt, Greece, and Rome created a distinctive aesthetic that was unmistakably Kushite, while reflecting the cosmopolitan nature of Meroitic society. The role of music and dance in Kushite religious and cultural life adds another dimension to our understanding of this remarkable civilization. Archaeological evidence suggests that Meroitic ceremonies featured elaborate musical performances using instruments that ranged from traditional African drums to sophisticated wind and string instruments influenced by Mediterranean traditions. The integration of these diverse musical traditions created soundscapes that enhanced the emotional impact of religious ceremonies while entertaining participants and spectators alike. The textile traditions that developed alongside these cultural innovations transformed Meroe into one of the ancient world's premier centres of cloth production. The cotton that grew so readily in the fertile lands around the capital provided the raw material for fabrics that were prized throughout Africa and the Mediterranean region. Kushite weavers developed techniques for creating textiles of extraordinary beauty and durability, incorporating dyes and decorative patterns that reflected both local traditions and international influences. The luxury goods industry that emerged from these textile innovations created new sources of wealth that further enhanced Meroitic prosperity. Royal workshops produced clothing and ceremonial garments that were worn by nobility throughout the region, while commercial producers supplied fabrics for everyday use that found ready markets in distant lands. The reputation of Kushite textiles spread far beyond the borders of the kingdom, creating demand that sustained entire communities of skilled craftsmen. The leather-working traditions that complemented textile production demonstrated the same combination of technical skill and artistic vision that characterized other Kushite crafts. The abundant cattle that grazed in the grasslands surrounding Meroe provided high-quality hides that were transformed into everything from military equipment to luxury goods. Kushite leatherworkers developed tanning and decorating techniques that produced materials of exceptional quality, creating products that were valued by customers throughout the known world. The jewelry-making traditions of Meroitic Kush reached levels of sophistication that amazed contemporary observers and continue to impress modern archaeologists. The abundance of gold in Kushite territory provided raw materials for creating ornaments of extraordinary beauty and complexity. Master craftsmen developed techniques for working precious metals that produced jewelry of remarkable delicacy and artistic merit, creating pieces that served both as personal adornment and as symbols of social status and political authority. The royal regalia that emerged from these jewelry-making traditions represented some of the finest examples of ancient African craftsmanship ever discovered. Crowns, scepters, and ceremonial weapons combined precious metals with exotic stones and intricate decorative work to create objects that projected royal authority while demonstrating the technical capabilities of Kushite artisans. These pieces were not merely symbols of power, but artistic achievements that reflected the cultural sophistication of the civilization that produced them. The trade networks that distributed these luxury goods extended throughout Africa and beyond, creating commercial relationships that brought prosperity to communities across the continent. Kushite merchants established trading posts in distant cities, creating permanent commercial connections that facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultural influences. The success of these commercial ventures demonstrated the entrepreneurial spirit and organizational capabilities that characterize Meroitic society. The diplomatic relationships that accompanied these commercial connections elevated Kush to a position of international prominence that few African kingdoms would ever achieve. Royal envoys travelled to courts throughout the Mediterranean world, negotiating treaties and trade agreements that recognized Kushite sovereignty and established the kingdom as a legitimate member of the international community. These diplomatic achievements required sophisticated understanding of international law and protocol, demonstrating the political maturity of Meroitic leadership. The educational institutions that supported these diplomatic and commercial activities produced generations of skilled professionals who could represent Kushite interests in foreign courts and manage complex international relationships. The ability to conduct business in multiple languages, navigate different legal systems, and understand diverse cultural practices required educational programs that rivaled those of any ancient civilization. The success of Kushite diplomacy and commerce testified to the effectiveness of these educational efforts. The scientific achievements of Meroitic scholars extended beyond practical applications to encompass theoretical investigations that advanced human understanding of the natural world. Astronomical observations conducted from Meroitic temples contributed to the development of calendar systems and navigational techniques that were used throughout the region. The mathematical knowledge required for architectural and engineering projects reached levels of sophistication that demonstrated the intellectual capabilities of Kushite learned men and women. The medical traditions that flourished in Meroitic society combined indigenous African healing practices with knowledge gained from contact with Egyptian, Greek, and Roman physicians. The result was a medical system that could address a wide range of ailments while maintaining the spiritual and cultural elements that were central to Kushite approaches to health and healing. The reputation of Kushite healers spread throughout the region, attracting patients from distant lands who sought treatments that were unavailable elsewhere. The agricultural innovations that supported Meroitic prosperity transformed the landscape around the capital into one of the most productive farming regions in Africa. Advanced irrigation systems channeled Nile waters to fields that produced abundant harvests of grains, vegetables, and cash crops that fed the urban population while generating surpluses for export. The engineering skills required for these irrigation projects demonstrated the technical capabilities that characterized Kushite approaches to infrastructure development. The animal husbandry practices that complemented agricultural production created one of the largest and most diverse livestock populations in the ancient world. Cattle, sheep, goats, and other domesticated animals provided food, raw materials for crafts, and transportation for both commercial and military purposes. The management of these animal populations required sophisticated understanding of breeding, feeding, and disease prevention that reflected the practical knowledge accumulated over centuries of pastoral life. Here at Obscure Historiesa, we find ourselves continually impressed by the depth and breadth of Meroitic achievements across virtually every aspect of human endeavour. The transformation of a kingdom that had once been defined by its relationship to Egypt into a civilization that created its own distinctive cultural forms represents one of the most remarkable examples of successful adaptation and innovation in human history. The Kushites demonstrated that political independence could be combined with cultural creativity to produce achievements that surpassed those of their former overlords. The urban planning principles that guided the development of Mero and other Meroitic cities reflected sophisticated understanding of the relationship between built environments and human behavior. The careful placement of religious, administrative, and residential districts created urban landscapes that functioned efficiently while projecting images of power and prosperity that impressed visitors and residents alike. The integration of public spaces, private residences, and commercial areas demonstrated planning capabilities that rivaled those of the greatest cities of antiquity. The water management systems that supported these urban centres represented engineering achievements of remarkable sophistication and durability. The construction of reservoirs, aqueducts, and drainage systems required technical knowledge and organizational capabilities that few ancient civilizations could match. The success of these infrastructure projects enabled Meroitic cities to support large populations while maintaining the sanitary conditions necessary for urban health and prosperity. The transportation networks that connected Meroitic cities to each other and to distant trading partners required engineering and maintenance capabilities that demonstrated the administrative sophistication of the kingdom. Roads, bridges, and river ports were constructed and maintained according to standards that facilitated efficient movement of people, goods, and information throughout the realm. The success of these transportation systems contributed directly to the economic prosperity and political unity that characterized the Meroitic Golden Age. The military engineering that protected these transportation networks and urban centers represented another area of Kushite technical achievement. Fortifications were designed and constructed according to principles that combined traditional defensive strategies with innovations adapted to local conditions and contemporary military threats. The effectiveness of these defensive works was demonstrated repeatedly when Kushite forces successfully repelled invasions and maintained territorial integrity against formidable enemies. The siege warfare capabilities that complemented these defensive preparations enabled Kushite armies to project power beyond their borders when political circumstances required military intervention. The engineering skills necessary for constructing siege equipment and conducting prolonged military campaigns demonstrated the technical and logistical capabilities that supported Kushite military success. The reputation of Kushite forces as effective besiegers added to their fearsome reputation throughout the region. The naval traditions that developed along the Nile and Red Sea coasts provided Kushite merchants and military forces with capabilities that extended their influence far beyond the traditional boundaries of land-based African kingdoms. Shipbuilding techniques adapted from Mediterranean models, but modified to suit local conditions and requirements produced vessels that could navigate both river and sea routes with equal effectiveness. The success of Kushite naval ventures contributed to the kingdom's commercial prosperity and military reach. The maritime trade routes that these naval capabilities opened connected Meroe to commercial networks that extended across the Indian Ocean and into the Far East. Archaeological evidence suggests regular contact with trading centers in Arabia, India, and possibly even Southeast Asia, indicating that Kushite merchants were active participants in the global economy of the ancient world. These long-distance commercial relationships brought exotic goods and new ideas to Meroe while carrying Kushite products and cultural influences to distant lands. The monetary systems that facilitated these complex commercial relationships demonstrated the economic sophistication that characterized Meroitic society. While many African kingdoms relied primarily on barter systems, the Kushites developed more advanced methods of conducting business that included standardized weights and measures, credit arrangements, and even primitive banking services. The effectiveness of these financial innovations contributed to the commercial success that sustained Meroitic prosperity for centuries. The legal systems that governed commercial relationships and resolved disputes reflected the political maturity and administrative sophistication of Meroitic governance. Courts and legal procedures were established according to principles that balanced traditional customs with practical requirements for managing a complex urban society. The success of these legal institutions in maintaining social order and commercial confidence contributed directly to the stability and prosperity that characterized the Meroitic Golden Age. The social mobility that characterized Meroitic society set it apart from many ancient civilizations where social status was rigidly determined by birth. Archaeological evidence suggests that skilled craftsmen, successful merchants, and capable administrators could achieve positions of wealth and influence regardless of their family origins. This meritocratic element in Kushite society encouraged innovation and entrepreneurship, while ensuring that the kingdom could benefit from the talents of its entire population. The women's roles in Meroitic society extended far beyond the royal court to encompass virtually every aspect of economic and cultural life. Female merchants, craftsmen, religious officials, and even military commanders appear in archaeological and textual evidence, indicating that Kushite society provided opportunities for women that were extraordinary by ancient standards. This gender equality contributed to the cultural vitality and economic dynamism that distinguished Meroe from its contemporaries. The cultural exchanges that resulted from these diverse social relationships created intellectual and artistic environments that fostered creativity and innovation. The mixing of different ethnic groups, social classes, and cultural traditions within Meroitic cities produced synthesis and hybridization that generated new forms of artistic expression, technological innovation, and social organization. The cosmopolitan character of Meroitic society became one of its greatest strengths and most distinctive characteristics. The preservation of cultural traditions alongside this innovation and adaptation demonstrated the sophisticated balance that Kushite society achieved between continuity and change. Ancient customs and beliefs were maintained and honored, while new ideas and practices were incorporated and adapted to local conditions. This cultural flexibility enabled the Kushites to maintain their distinctive identity while benefiting from contact with other civilizations. The literary traditions that developed during the Meroitic period provide glimpses into the intellectual and cultural life of this remarkable civilization. While many texts have not survived or remain undeciphered, the examples that have been translated reveal sophisticated understanding of history, religion, law, and literature. The development of indigenous literary forms demonstrated the cultural confidence and intellectual maturity that characterized Meroitic society at its height. The historical consciousness that these literary works reveal shows that the Kushites understood their place in the broader sweep of human history while taking pride in their own unique achievements. Royal inscriptions and religious texts celebrated both the continuity with ancient traditions and the innovations that distinguished Meroitic civilization from its predecessors. This historical awareness contributed to the cultural identity that sustained the kingdom through centuries of political and social change. As we continue to explore the remarkable achievements of Meroitic Kush, we discover a civilization that successfully combined respect for tradition with openness to innovation, creating a society that was both distinctively African and genuinely cosmopolitan. The balance between continuity and change that characterized Kushite culture enabled them to maintain their independence and prosperity while adapting to changing circumstances and opportunities. The legacy of these achievements extends far beyond the immediate boundaries of the Kushite kingdom to influence the development of African civilization for centuries to come. The political innovations, technological advances, and cultural achievements of Meroitic Kush provided models and inspiration for later African kingdoms, while demonstrating the potential for indigenous African societies to achieve greatness on their own terms. Yet even as we celebrate these remarkable accomplishments, we must recognize that the golden age of Meroe would eventually face challenges that would test the resilience and adaptability that had sustained the kingdom through previous crises. The rise of new regional powers, shifts in international trade patterns, and internal developments would all contribute to transformations that would reshape the character of Kushite civilization yet again, leading to new chapters in this extraordinary story of African achievement and adaptation. The religious and cultural synthesis that emerged during Meroe's golden age created spiritual traditions that were simultaneously deeply African and remarkably cosmopolitan. The great temples that dominated the city's skyline housed ceremonies that blended ancient Kushite rituals with influences absorbed from generations of contact with distant civilizations. Yet these were not mere imitations of foreign practices, but genuine innovations that reflected the unique perspective and creative vision of Meroitic society. The priesthood that oversaw these religious institutions developed into one of the most learned and influential classes in Kushite society. These religious leaders were far more than ceremonial figures. They were scholars, advisors, and keepers of cultural memory, who maintained libraries containing texts in multiple languages and writing systems. Their influence extended throughout the kingdom, as they served not only as spiritual guides, but as educators, judges, and diplomatic representatives when dealing with foreign powers. The festivals and ceremonies that marked the Meroitic religious calendar became spectacular displays of royal power and cultural sophistication that attracted visitors from across the known world. These events featured elaborate processions, musical performances, athletic competitions, and artistic displays that demonstrated the wealth and creativity of Kushite civilization. The coordination required for such massive public spectacles revealed the organizational capabilities and administrative efficiency that characterize Meroitic governance at its peak. The artistic traditions that flourished during these celebrations produced works of extraordinary beauty and technical sophistication that rivaled the finest achievements of any ancient civilization. Kushite craftsmen developed techniques for working precious metals, carving stone, and creating textiles that were entirely their own, producing objects that were unmistakably African, while incorporating influences from across the Mediterranean world and beyond. The royal workshops that produced these artistic masterpieces became centers of innovation, where traditional techniques were refined and new methods were developed through experimentation and cross-cultural exchange. Master craftsmen trained apprentices in skills that had been passed down through generations, while encouraging them to explore new possibilities and push the boundaries of their respective arts. The luxury goods that emerged from these workshops found eager markets throughout Africa and the Mediterranean region, creating commercial relationships that brought both wealth and cultural influence to the Kushite kingdom. Meroitic jewelry, textiles, and decorative objects became status symbols among the elite of distant civilizations, carrying Kushite artistic influence to courts and cities far from the Nile Valley. The commercial networks that distributed these goods extended far beyond traditional trade routes to encompass relationships with merchants and kingdoms that previous generations of Kushites could never have imagined reaching. Archaeological discoveries have revealed Meroitic objects in locations as distant as the Roman frontiers in Europe and trading centers along the Indian Ocean, demonstrating the remarkable reach of Kushite commercial influence during this golden age. The diplomatic relationships that accompanied these commercial connections elevated Kush to a position of international prominence that reflected both the kingdom's wealth and the political sophistication of its leadership. Meroitic ambassadors were received at royal courts throughout the known world, where they negotiated treaties and trade agreements that recognized Kushite sovereignty and established the kingdom as a legitimate member of the international community. These diplomatic achievements required not only political skill, but also cultural knowledge that enabled Kushite representatives to navigate the complex protocols and expectations of different civilizations. The success of Meroitic diplomacy demonstrated the educational sophistication that had developed within the kingdom, producing individuals capable of representing Kushite interests effectively in the most demanding international environments. The educational institutions that supported these diplomatic and commercial activities became centers of learning that attracted students from throughout Africa and beyond. The curriculum developed for these schools combined traditional Kushite knowledge with learning drawn from Egyptian, Greek, Roman, and other sources, creating educational programs that were both comprehensive and innovative. The intellectual achievements that resulted from this educational sophistication extended across virtually every field of human knowledge. Meroitic scholars made contributions to astronomy, mathematics, engineering, medicine, and other disciplines that demonstrated the high level of learning that flourished within the kingdom. Their observations and calculations were sophisticated enough to support the complex architectural and engineering projects that transformed the landscape around Mero. The medical traditions that developed during this period combined indigenous African healing practices with knowledge gained through contact with physicians from other civilizations. Meroitic healers became renowned throughout the region for their ability to treat conditions that baffled practitioners elsewhere, attracting patients who traveled great distances, seeking remedies that were unavailable in their homelands. The agricultural innovations that supported this cultural and intellectual flowering transformed the region around Meroe into one of the most productive farming areas in ancient Africa. Advanced irrigation systems channeled Nile waters to fields that produced abundant harvests, while engineering projects created storage facilities that could preserve grain through lean years and provide reserves for emergency situations. The animal husbandry practices that complemented these agricultural achievements created livestock populations that were among the largest and most diverse in the ancient world. The management of these herds required sophisticated understanding of breeding, nutrition, and disease prevention that reflected centuries of accumulated pastoral knowledge adapted to local conditions and enhanced through contact with other civilizations. The transportation infrastructure that connected agricultural regions to urban centers and international trade routes represented engineering achievements that facilitated the efficient movement of goods, people, and information throughout the kingdom. Roads, bridges, and harbor facilities were constructed and maintained according to standards that enabled Meroitic merchants and administrators to conduct business with an efficiency that few ancient civilizations could match. The military organization that protected these economic assets and territorial holdings evolved to meet the changing strategic requirements of an increasingly prosperous and influential kingdom. While traditional Kushite military strengths in archery and desert warfare remained central to their defensive capabilities, new weapons, tactics, and organizational methods were incorporated to address emerging threats and opportunities. The fortification systems that protected Meroitic cities and strategic positions demonstrated engineering sophistication that combined traditional defensive principles with innovations adapted to contemporary military technology. These defensive works were designed not merely to withstand siege, but to project images of power and determination that would discourage potential aggressors from attempting attacks in the first place. The naval capabilities that developed along the Nile and Red Sea coasts provided Kushite forces with strategic mobility that extended their military reach far beyond traditional land-based limitations. Shipbuilding techniques adapted from Mediterranean models, but modified for local conditions, produced vessels capable of conducting both commercial and military operations across extensive water networks. The siege warfare capabilities that complemented these naval and defensive preparations enabled Kushite armies to project power offensively when political circumstances required military intervention. The engineering skills necessary for conducting prolonged military campaigns demonstrated the logistical and technical capabilities that supported Kushite military effectiveness throughout the region. Here at Obscure Historiesa, we find ourselves continually amazed by the comprehensive nature of Meroitic achievements across virtually every aspect of civilization. The transformation of what had once been a regional kingdom into a major power capable of competing with the greatest civilizations of antiquity represents one of the most remarkable success stories in human history. The urban planning principles that guided the development of Meroitic cities reflected sophisticated understanding of the relationships between built environments, social organization, and economic activity. The careful integration of residential, commercial, religious, and administrative districts created urban landscapes that functioned efficiently while projecting images of prosperity and power that impressed both residents and visitors. The water management systems that supported these urban centers represented engineering achievements that enabled large populations to thrive in challenging environmental conditions. The construction and maintenance of reservoirs, aqueducts, and drainage systems required technical knowledge and organizational capabilities that demonstrated the high level of administrative sophistication that characterized Meroitic governance. The social mobility that distinguished Meroitic society from many contemporary civilizations created opportunities for talented individuals to advance regardless of their family origins. Archaeological evidence suggests that skilled craftsmen, successful merchants, and capable administrators could achieve positions of wealth and influence through merit and achievement rather than hereditary status alone. The role of women in Meroitic society extended far beyond the famous queens and royal women to encompass participation in virtually every aspect of economic, cultural, and social life. Female merchants, craftsmen, religious officials, and even military leaders appear in surviving records, indicating that Kushite society provided opportunities for women that were extraordinary by the standards of the ancient world. The cultural exchanges that resulted from this social diversity and openness created intellectual environments that fostered creativity and innovation across multiple fields of endeavor. The mixing of different ethnic groups, social classes, and cultural traditions within Meroitic cities produced synthesis and hybridization that generated new forms of artistic expression, technological advancement, and social organization. The preservation of traditional customs alongside this innovation and adaptation demonstrated the sophisticated cultural balance that enabled Kushite society to maintain its distinctive identity while benefiting from contact with other civilizations. Ancient beliefs and practices were honored and maintained while new ideas and methods were evaluated and incorporated when they proved beneficial. The literary traditions that flourished during this period provide glimpses into the intellectual and cultural sophistication of Meroitic society. While many texts remain undeciphered or have not survived, the examples that can be read reveal complex understanding of history, law, religion, and literature that demonstrates the high level of learning that characterized the kingdom's educated classes. The historical consciousness that emerges from these literary works shows that the Kushites understood their place within the broader sweep of human civilization, while taking legitimate pride in their own unique achievements. Royal inscriptions celebrated both continuity with ancient traditions and the innovations that distinguished Meroitic culture from its predecessors and contemporaries. The legal systems that governed this complex society reflected the political maturity and administrative sophistication that enabled the kingdom to maintain stability and prosperity across centuries of change. Courts and legal procedures were established according to principles that balanced traditional customs with practical requirements for managing diverse urban populations and extensive commercial relationships. The monetary and commercial systems that facilitated economic activity demonstrated financial sophistication that enabled Kushite merchants to participate effectively in international trade networks that spanned continents. Standardized weights and measures, credit arrangements, and banking services provided the institutional framework necessary for conducting complex business relationships with partners throughout the known world. The technological innovations that emerged from Meroitic workshops and laboratories contributed to advances in metallurgy, engineering, agriculture, and other fields that influenced development throughout Africa and beyond. The iron industry that flourished around Meroe became a model for similar enterprises in other regions, while innovations in goldworking and other crafts spread through trade networks to distant lands. The scientific achievements of Meroitic scholars extended beyond immediate practical applications to encompass theoretical investigations that advanced human understanding of astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and other disciplines. The knowledge accumulated through these investigations supported the architectural, engineering, and navigational achievements that characterized Kushite civilization at its height. The religious innovations that emerged during this golden age created spiritual traditions that were simultaneously rooted in ancient African beliefs and enriched by contact with other civilizations. The synthesis of indigenous and foreign religious elements produced theological systems that were uniquely Kushite while remaining accessible to visitors and converts from diverse cultural backgrounds. The architectural achievements that expressed these religious and cultural innovations produced monuments that ranked among the greatest building projects of the ancient world. The pyramids, temples, and palaces that rose throughout the kingdom demonstrated technical mastery and aesthetic sophistication that rivaled the finest achievements of any contemporary civilization. The artistic traditions that decorated these architectural masterpieces reflected the cultural confidence and creative vision that characterized Meroitic society at its peak. Sculptural programs, wall paintings, and decorative objects combined traditional African motifs with influences from across the Mediterranean world to create artistic expressions that were unmistakably Kushite, while remaining universally appealing. The musical and performative traditions that accompanied religious ceremonies and royal celebrations created cultural experiences that enhanced the emotional and spiritual impact of these important occasions. The integration of diverse musical instruments and performance styles produced soundscapes and spectacles that impressed participants and observers, while strengthening social bonds and cultural identity. The textile and fashion traditions that developed during this period transformed personal adornment and clothing into forms of artistic expression that reflected both individual taste and social status. The cotton that grew abundantly in the fertile regions around Meroe provided raw materials for fabrics that became prized throughout Africa and the Mediterranean world for their quality and beauty. The culinary traditions that evolved during this cosmopolitan period combined indigenous African foodways with influences absorbed through contact with other civilizations. The result was a cuisine that satisfied both practical nutritional needs and aesthetic desires, while reflecting the cultural diversity and sophistication that characterized Meroitic society. The recreational and sporting activities that flourished during this golden age provided entertainment and social bonding opportunities that strengthened community relationships while celebrating physical prowess and competitive achievement. Archaeological evidence suggests that Meroitic cities featured facilities for various games and sports that attracted participants and spectators from throughout the region. The festival calendar that governed these recreational activities and religious observances created a rhythm of celebration and ceremony that marked the passage of time while reinforcing cultural values and social relationships. These events served not only as entertainment, but as occasions for displaying royal power, strengthening political alliances, and maintaining the cultural cohesion that enabled the kingdom to function effectively. The diplomatic protocols that governed interactions with foreign powers reflected the political sophistication and cultural confidence that enabled Kushite leaders to negotiate as equals with the representatives of major civilizations. The success of these diplomatic relationships demonstrated the international recognition and respect that Meroitic achievements had earned for the kingdom. The commercial relationships that complemented these diplomatic connections created economic networks that brought prosperity to communities throughout the kingdom, while establishing Kushite merchants as important players in international trade. The reputation for quality and reliability that Meroitic goods earned in foreign markets generated demand that sustained prosperity for generations. The educational exchanges that accompanied these commercial and diplomatic relationships brought knowledge and ideas to Meroe, while carrying Kushite learning and innovations to distant lands. The intellectual cross-fertilization that resulted from these exchanges contributed to advances in multiple fields, while establishing Meroitic scholars as respected contributors to the global community of learning. The technological transfers that occurred through these international connections introduced new methods and techniques to Kushite craftsmen and engineers, while carrying Meroitic innovations to other civilizations. The bidirectional nature of these exchanges demonstrated the sophisticated balance that the Kushites achieved between learning from others and contributing their own discoveries and improvements. The cultural influences that flowed through these international networks enriched Meroitic artistic and intellectual traditions, while carrying Kushite cultural expressions to audiences throughout the known world. The synthesis of diverse cultural elements that occurred within Meroitic society produced innovations that influenced artistic and intellectual development across multiple civilizations. The military technologies and tactics that evolved through these international contacts enhanced Kushite defensive capabilities, while contributing to military developments in other regions. The reputation of Kushite warriors as elite fighters created opportunities for military service abroad, while ensuring that the kingdom remained capable of defending its independence and territorial integrity. The architectural techniques and engineering methods that spread through these networks of exchange influenced building projects throughout Africa and beyond, while incorporating innovations developed in other civilizations. The result was an architectural tradition that was distinctively Kushite, while remaining part of the broader Mediterranean and African building traditions. The agricultural methods and technologies that were shared through these relationships enhanced food production throughout the region, while introducing new crops and techniques that improved nutrition and economic opportunities. The agricultural prosperity that resulted from these innovations supported population growth and urbanization that sustained the kingdom's expansion and development. As we explore the full scope of Meroitic achievements during this remarkable period, we begin to appreciate the comprehensive nature of the transformation that converted a regional African kingdom into a major civilization capable of competing with the greatest powers of the ancient world. The Kushites demonstrated that political independence could be combined with cultural creativity and economic innovation to produce achievements that surpassed those of their former overlords and contemporary rivals. The legacy of these accomplishments extended far beyond the immediate boundaries of the Kushite kingdom to influence the development of African civilization for centuries to come. The political innovations, technological advances, and cultural achievements of Meroitic Kush provided models and inspiration for later African kingdoms while demonstrating the potential for indigenous African societies to achieve greatness through their own efforts and vision. Yet even as we celebrate these extraordinary accomplishments, we must recognize that the golden age of Mero would eventually encounter challenges that would test the resilience and adaptability that had sustained the kingdom through previous crises and transformations. The rise of new regional powers, shifts in international trade patterns, environmental changes, and internal developments would all contribute to pressures that would reshape the character of Kushite civilization once more. The emergence of the Aksumite kingdom in the Ethiopian highlands created a new center of power that began to compete with Meroe for control of Red Sea trade routes that had been crucial to Kushite prosperity. This competition would force Meroitic leaders to adapt their commercial and diplomatic strategies, while seeking new sources of wealth and influence to maintain their position in the changing political landscape of ancient Africa. The expansion of Roman power throughout the Mediterranean region created new opportunities and challenges that would test Kushite diplomatic skills and strategic flexibility. While the kingdom had successfully resisted Roman military expansion, the growing influence of Roman commercial and cultural networks would present more subtle challenges that would require different types of responses and adaptations. The spread of Christianity throughout the Roman world and into Africa would introduce religious and cultural changes that would challenge traditional Kushite beliefs and practices, while offering new possibilities for international relationships and cultural exchange. The kingdom's response to these religious developments would prove crucial in determining its future character and trajectory. The climate changes that began to affect the Nile Valley during the later centuries of Meroitic rule would create agricultural and economic pressures that would test the kingdom's ability to adapt to environmental challenges. The irrigation systems and agricultural techniques that had supported the Golden Age would need to be modified or replaced to address changing conditions. The internal political developments that accompanied these external pressures would create additional challenges for Kushite leadership as they sought to maintain unity and stability while adapting to rapidly changing circumstances. The balance between continuity and change that had characterized successful Kushite governance would be tested as never before during the trials that lay ahead. The transformation of Christianity from a marginal religious movement to the dominant faith of the Mediterranean world created profound ripple effects that would eventually reach the heart of Africa itself. By the 4th century CE, Christian missionaries and traders had begun penetrating the traditional trade routes that connected the Roman world to the kingdoms of Nubia and Ethiopia. For the Kushites, who had successfully maintained their independence and cultural identity through centuries of contact with various civilizations, this new religious influence represented both an opportunity and a challenge that would fundamentally reshape their society. The initial encounters between Christian missionaries and Meroitic society occurred primarily through commercial networks that had long connected the kingdom to Mediterranean markets. Christian merchants who travelled the Nile trade routes brought with them not only goods, but also religious ideas that began to circulate among Kushite communities. These early contacts were generally peaceful, as the Kushites had always demonstrated remarkable tolerance for diverse religious traditions and had successfully incorporated elements from various belief systems into their own spiritual practices. The appeal of Christianity to certain segments of Kushite society reflected both the universality of its message and its compatibility with existing social structures. The Christian emphasis on charity and social justice resonated with Kushite traditions of royal responsibility for the welfare of subjects, while the religion's acceptance of female religious leadership aligned with the prominent role that women had always played in Kushite society. The stories of powerful Christian queens and female saints provided models that Kushite women could embrace without abandoning their own traditions of female authority. The process of Christianization in Kush was neither sudden nor uniform, but rather a gradual transformation that unfolded over several generations. Archaeological evidence suggests that Christian symbols and motifs began appearing in Meroitic art and architecture during the 4th century, initially alongside traditional religious imagery, rather than replacing it. This syncretic approach reflected the sophisticated theological flexibility that had always characterized Kushite religious practices. The royal court's response to Christianity revealed the political acumen that had enabled Kushite rulers to navigate complex international relationships throughout their history. Rather than rejecting the new faith outright or embracing it completely, Meroitic monarchs adopted a pragmatic approach that allowed Christian influences to develop naturally while maintaining the traditional religious foundations of royal authority. This balanced response enabled the kingdom to benefit from improved relationships with Christian powers while preserving the cultural continuity that was essential to political stability. The conversion of significant portions of the Kushite population to Christianity occurred gradually through a combination of missionary activity and popular appeal, rather than through royal decree or military conquest. Christian communities established churches and monasteries throughout the kingdom, creating centers of learning and social service that attracted converts through practical benefits as well as spiritual appeal. These Christian institutions often incorporated elements of traditional Kushite architecture and decoration, creating a distinctly African form of Christian expression. The impact of Christianity on Kushite society extended far beyond purely religious matters to encompass changes in art, architecture, literature, and social organization. Christian themes began appearing in Meroitic artistic works, while church construction introduced new architectural forms that would influence building traditions throughout the region. The establishment of Christian schools and scriptoriums created new centers of literacy and learning that preserved both Christian texts and traditional Kushite knowledge. The relationship between Christianity and traditional Kushite religious practices remained complex and varied throughout different regions and social groups within the kingdom. While some communities embraced Christianity completely, others maintained traditional beliefs while incorporating certain Christian elements, and still others resisted Christian influence entirely. This diversity of religious response reflected the decentralized nature of Meroitic society and the tolerance for religious diversity that had always characterized Kushite culture. The political implications of Christianization became increasingly significant as the religion spread throughout the kingdom and began to influence relationships with neighboring powers. The Byzantine Empire, which had inherited the eastern portions of the Roman Empire, viewed the Christianization of Kush as an opportunity to extend its influence southward along the Nile. However, the Kushites were careful to maintain their political independence even as they embraced aspects of Christian culture and belief. The economic consequences of religious transformation created both opportunities and challenges for Meroitic society. Christian pilgrimage routes and religious festivals attracted visitors from throughout the Christian world, generating new sources of revenue for communities along these routes. However, The decline of traditional religious practices also meant the loss of income from pilgrims who had previously visited ancient temples and participated in traditional ceremonies. The cultural synthesis that emerged from this religious transformation produced distinctly Kushite forms of Christian expression that reflected the kingdom's unique history and identity. Kushite Christian art incorporated traditional African motifs and symbols, while church architecture adapted Mediterranean models to local conditions and aesthetic preferences. The result was a form of Christianity that was authentically African while remaining connected to the broader Christian world. The literary traditions that developed within Kushite Christian communities created new forms of religious and historical writing that preserved both Christian teachings and traditional Kushite knowledge. Christian scribes translated religious texts into local languages, while also recording traditional stories and historical accounts that might otherwise have been lost. This literary activity contributed to the preservation of Kushite cultural memory even as society underwent religious transformation. The monastic traditions that emerged within Kushite Christianity reflected both Mediterranean influences and indigenous African spiritual practices. Kushite monasteries became centers of learning and manuscript production that rivaled similar institutions throughout the Christian world. These religious communities also served as repositories of traditional knowledge and cultural practices, ensuring that important elements of Kushite heritage survived the process of religious change. The impact of Christianity on women's roles in Kushite society proved particularly complex, as the new religion both supported and challenged traditional patterns of female authority. While Christianity provided new models of female religious leadership through the examples of saints and abbesses, it also introduced patriarchal elements that were less compatible with traditional Kushite gender relations. The resolution of these tensions varied throughout the kingdom and contributed to the diverse forms that Kushite Christianity eventually took. The architectural legacy of Kushite Christianity created monuments that ranked among the most impressive religious buildings in Africa. Christian churches and monasteries built throughout the kingdom demonstrated sophisticated engineering and artistic capabilities while incorporating distinctly African design elements. These structures served not only as places of worship, but as symbols of the successful synthesis of Christian and Kushite cultures. The educational institutions that developed within Kushite Christian communities became important centers of learning that attracted students from throughout Africa and beyond. These schools taught both Christian theology and traditional subjects such as mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, creating a curriculum that combined religious instruction with practical education. The reputation of Kushite Christian scholars spread throughout the region, establishing the kingdom as an important center of Christian learning in Africa. The diplomatic relationships that emerged from Kushite Christianization opened new channels of communication with Christian powers throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. Kushite Christian rulers exchanged embassies with Byzantine emperors and other Christian monarchs, creating political relationships that were based on shared religious identity rather than purely commercial or military considerations. These diplomatic connections provided new sources of support and alliance that helped maintain Kushite independence. The commercial networks that developed through Christian connections created new opportunities for Kushite merchants and craftsmen to reach markets that had previously been difficult to access. Christian pilgrimage routes and religious festivals provided new venues for trade, while shared religious identity facilitated business relationships with Christian merchants from other regions. These commercial advantages helped offset some of the economic disruptions caused by changes in traditional trade patterns. The military implications of Christianization proved complex, as the new religion both provided new sources of alliance and created new forms of conflict. Christian Kushite rulers could appeal for support from other Christian powers when facing non-Christian enemies, but they also faced pressure to participate in Christian military campaigns that might not serve Kushite interests. The balance between religious solidarity and political independence became an ongoing challenge for Kushite leadership. Here, at Obscure Historiesa, we find the Christianization of Kush to be one of the most fascinating examples of religious and cultural transformation in ancient history. The process by which a traditionally African kingdom successfully incorporated a Mediterranean religion while maintaining its distinctive identity demonstrates the remarkable adaptability and cultural sophistication that characterized Kushite civilization throughout its long history. The artistic innovations that emerged from this religious synthesis created new forms of expression that were simultaneously Christian and distinctly African. Kushite Christian artists developed techniques for depicting religious scenes that incorporated traditional African aesthetic elements while remaining faithful to Christian theological requirements. The result was an artistic tradition that enriched both Christian and African cultural heritage. The linguistic developments that accompanied Christianization contributed to the evolution of writing systems and literary traditions throughout the region. Christian texts were translated into local languages using adapted scripts, while new forms of religious and secular literature emerged that reflected the cultural synthesis occurring within Kushite society. These linguistic innovations influenced literary development throughout northeastern Africa. The social changes that resulted from Christian influence affected virtually every aspect of Kushite life, from family structures to economic organization to political governance. While some traditional practices were modified or abandoned, others were reinforced and given new religious significance within Christian frameworks. The result was a society that remained recognizably Kushite while incorporating elements that connected it to the broader Christian world. The theological developments that emerged from Kushite Christianity contributed to broader discussions within the Christian church about the relationship between faith and culture. Kushite Christian theologians grappled with questions about how Christian teachings should be adapted to African contexts while maintaining doctrinal orthodoxy. Their contributions to these debates influenced Christian thought throughout Africa and beyond. The pilgrimage traditions that developed within Kushite Christianity created new patterns of religious travel and cultural exchange that connected the kingdom to holy sites throughout the Christian world. Kushite pilgrims traveled to Jerusalem, Constantinople, and other major Christian centers, while foreign pilgrims visited important Kushite Christian sites. These religious journeys facilitated cultural exchange and maintained connections between Kushite Christianity and the broader Christian community. The festival calendar that emerged from Kushite Christian communities blended traditional seasonal celebrations with Christian holy days, creating a religious calendar that honored both African agricultural cycles and Christian theological themes. These festivals served as occasions for community celebration and religious observance, while maintaining connections to traditional cultural practices. The healing traditions that developed within Kushite Christianity combined traditional African medicine with Christian spiritual practices, creating therapeutic approaches that addressed both physical and spiritual needs. Kushite Christian healers became renowned throughout the region for their ability to treat various ailments through combinations of herbal medicine, prayer, and ritual healing practices. The educational philosophy that characterized Kushite Christian schools reflected the synthesis of Christian and traditional African approaches to learning and personal development. These institutions emphasized both intellectual achievement and spiritual growth, while maintaining respect for traditional knowledge and cultural values. The graduates of these schools became leaders in various fields throughout the kingdom and beyond. The architectural innovations that emerged from church construction in Kush influenced building traditions throughout northeastern Africa and provided models that were adapted by other African Christian communities. The distinctive style of Kushite Christian architecture combined Mediterranean structural techniques with African aesthetic elements and environmental adaptations. The manuscript traditions that developed within Kushite Christian scriptoriums created distinctive forms of book production and decoration that reflected both Christian iconographic conventions and traditional African artistic motifs. These manuscripts became prized possessions that were copied and distributed throughout the Christian world, carrying Kushite cultural influences to distant lands. The musical traditions that evolved within Kushite Christian communities blended traditional African musical forms with Christian liturgical requirements, creating distinctive styles of religious music that enhanced worship experiences while preserving important elements of cultural heritage. These musical innovations influenced Christian worship practices throughout the region. The charitable institutions that were established by Kushite Christian communities reflected both Christian teachings about social responsibility and traditional African values regarding community mutual support. These institutions provided assistance to the poor, care for the sick, and education for the young, creating social services that strengthened community bonds while expressing religious devotion. The scholarly traditions that flourished within Kushite Christian centers of learning produced theological, historical, and scientific works that contributed to knowledge throughout the Christian world. Kushite Christian scholars maintained correspondence with learned men throughout the Mediterranean region while preserving and transmitting traditional African knowledge through Christian institutional frameworks. The artistic patronage that characterized Kushite Christian rulers and wealthy believers created opportunities for craftsmen and artists to develop new forms of religious expression while maintaining traditional technical skills and aesthetic sensibilities. The works produced through this patronage demonstrated the successful integration of Christian and African cultural elements. The trade guilds that developed within Kushite Christian communities provided organizational structures for craftsmen and merchants that combined economic functions with religious and social purposes. These guilds maintained professional standards while providing mutual support and religious fellowship for their members. The legal traditions that evolved within Kushite Christian society blended Christian moral teachings with traditional African legal principles, creating legal systems that address the needs of increasingly diverse communities while maintaining cultural continuity. These legal innovations influenced jurisprudence throughout the region. The agricultural practices that were modified through Christian influence incorporated new crops and techniques introduced through Christian trade networks, while maintaining traditional farming methods that were well adapted to local conditions. These agricultural innovations contributed to continued prosperity while supporting larger populations. The urban planning principles that guided the development of Kushite Christian cities reflected both Christian architectural requirements and traditional African approaches to community organization. The result was urban landscapes that functioned effectively while expressing both religious devotion and cultural identity. The maritime traditions that developed through Christian connections opened new sea routes that connected Kushite ports to Christian communities throughout the Red Sea region and beyond. These maritime networks facilitated both commercial exchange and religious communication, while demonstrating the continued adaptability of Kushite civilization. The military organizations that emerged within Christianized Kushite society combined traditional warrior traditions with Christian concepts of just warfare and divine protection. These military innovations maintained the kingdom's defensive capabilities while adapting to new strategic requirements and alliance opportunities. The diplomatic protocols that were developed for relations with Christian powers reflected both Christian concepts of international relations and traditional Kushite approaches to foreign policy. These diplomatic innovations enabled the kingdom to maintain beneficial relationships with Christian neighbors while preserving political independence. The commercial law that evolved within Kushite Christian society provided frameworks for conducting business with Christian partners while maintaining traditional trading relationships with non-Christian communities. These legal innovations facilitated continued commercial prosperity while adapting to changing market conditions. The textile traditions that developed within Kushite Christian communities incorporated new designs and techniques influenced by Christian symbolism while maintaining traditional African weaving and decorating methods. These textile innovations created new products for both domestic use and export markets. The metallurgical practices that continued within Christianized Kushite society maintained traditional technical excellence while incorporating new decorative motifs and symbolic elements derived from Christian art and theology. These innovations sustained the kingdom's reputation for high-quality metalwork while adapting to changing aesthetic preferences. The transportation systems that were developed to serve Kushite Christian communities facilitated movement between churches, monasteries, and pilgrimage sites while maintaining the infrastructure necessary for continued commercial and administrative functions. These transportation innovations supported both religious and secular activities. The seasonal celebrations that emerged from the synthesis of Christian and traditional African calendars created community events that honored both Christian holy days and traditional agricultural and social cycles. These celebrations strengthened social bonds while expressing religious devotion and cultural identity. The funeral practices that developed within Kushite Christian communities blended Christian burial customs with traditional African approaches to honoring the deceased and maintaining connections between the living and the dead. These practices reflected theological synthesis while providing comfort and continuity for bereaved families. The marriage customs that evolved within Christianized Kushite society incorporated Christian sacramental concepts while maintaining traditional African approaches to family formation and community relationships. These customs reflected successful adaptation to religious change while preserving important social institutions. The coming-of-age ceremonies that were adapted within Kushite Christian communities combined Christian concepts of spiritual development with traditional African recognition of the transition from childhood to adulthood. These ceremonies maintained important social functions while expressing religious commitment. Yet even as Kushite society successfully adapted to Christian influence and created new forms of cultural expression that enriched both Christian and African traditions, external pressures were building that would challenge the kingdom's continued independence and prosperity. The rise of Islamic power in the Middle East and North Africa created new political and religious dynamics that would profoundly affect the balance of power throughout the Nile Valley and the broader region. The expansion of Islamic influence southward along traditional trade routes brought both opportunities and challenges that would test the adaptability that had enabled Kushite civilization to survive and thrive through previous periods of transformation. The kingdom's response to these new pressures would determine whether the remarkable synthesis of cultures and traditions that had characterized Meroitic society could continue to evolve and flourish in a rapidly changing world. The economic disruptions that accompanied these broader regional changes created additional pressures that would strain the prosperity and stability that had sustained Kushite civilization for so many centuries. Traditional trade routes were being redirected, established commercial relationships were being challenged, and new competitors were emerging who possessed advantages that would be difficult for the Kushites to match. The environmental changes that were simultaneously affecting the Nile Valley created agricultural and demographic pressures that would compound the political and economic challenges facing Kushite leadership. The irrigation systems and farming techniques that had supported centuries of prosperity would need to be adapted to changing conditions while maintaining the food production necessary to sustain urban populations and commercial activities. The internal political developments that emerged in response to these multiple pressures would test the governmental institutions and leadership traditions that had enabled the kingdom to maintain unity and effectiveness through previous crises. The balance between continuity and change that had characterized successful Kushite governance would face its greatest test as the civilization entered what would prove to be its final period of independent existence. The military challenges that emerged during this period of transformation revealed both the enduring strengths and emerging vulnerabilities of Kushite civilization. While their legendary archers remained formidable warriors whose skills were still respected throughout the region, the changing nature of warfare itself was creating new requirements that stretched traditional military capabilities. The rise of heavily armored cavalry, sophisticated siege techniques, and coordinated infantry formations developed by emerging powers demanded tactical innovations that would test the adaptability of Kushite commanders. The strategic geography that had long protected the kingdom began to work against Meroitic interests as new trade routes bypassed traditional Nile Valley networks. The Red Sea commerce that had enriched Kushite ports for centuries increasingly flowed through alternative channels, controlled by rising maritime powers. Overland caravan routes that had once converged on Meroitic cities were being redirected toward new commercial centers that offered more direct access to emerging markets and political alliances. The demographic pressures that accompanied these economic disruptions created internal tensions that challenged traditional social structures. Urban populations that had grown accustomed to prosperity found themselves facing reduced opportunities and declining living standards. Rural communities struggled with changing agricultural conditions while supporting urban centers that could no longer provide the same levels of economic opportunity and political stability that had characterized previous generations. The technological innovations that had once given Kushite craftsmen competitive advantages in international markets were being matched or surpassed by competitors who possessed access to new materials, techniques, and production methods. The iron industry that had been central to Meroitic prosperity faced competition from regions that could produce similar goods more efficiently or at lower costs. The luxury crafts that had distinguished Kushite artisans encountered changing aesthetic preferences and reduced demand in traditional markets. The religious transformations that continued throughout this period created additional complexity as different communities within the kingdom developed varying approaches to spiritual and cultural identity. Some regions embraced Christian practices completely, while others maintained traditional beliefs, and still others attempted to synthesize elements from multiple religious traditions. This diversity of religious expression reflected the cultural sophistication that had always characterized Kushite society, but it also created challenges for maintaining political unity and shared identity. The administrative systems that had managed the kingdom's affairs during its golden age found themselves struggling to address problems that were unprecedented in their scope and complexity. The governmental institutions that had coordinated military campaigns, managed commercial relationships, and maintained internal order were designed for conditions that no longer prevailed. Adapting these systems to new realities required innovations that would test the political wisdom and flexibility of Kushite leadership. The architectural projects that had symbolized royal power and cultural achievement became increasingly difficult to finance and complete as resources were diverted to address more immediate needs. The pyramid construction that had continued for centuries began to decline as royal resources were redirected toward defensive preparations and administrative reforms. The temple complexes that had served as centers of religious and cultural life struggled to maintain their traditional roles as communities grappled with changing circumstances. The educational institutions that had produced the scholars, administrators, and craftsmen who had sustained Kushite civilization found their curricula and methods challenged by new requirements and opportunities. The knowledge systems that had served the kingdom well during previous periods needed to be updated and expanded to address contemporary challenges, while preserving the cultural foundations that had enabled Kushite society to maintain its distinctive identity. The commercial networks that had connected Meroitic merchants to markets throughout the known world faced disruption from political changes, route modifications, and competitive pressures that reduced both profitability and reliability. The trading relationships that had been built over generations required constant renegotiation as political circumstances changed and new players entered traditional markets with advantages that were difficult for Kushite merchants to match. The diplomatic relationships that had enabled the kingdom to maintain beneficial connections with major powers became increasingly complex as those powers pursued policies that did not always align with Kushite interests. The balance between independence and cooperation that had characterized successful Kushite foreign policy required constant adjustment as regional political dynamics shifted and new alliances formed that did not include traditional Kushite partnerships. The cultural exchanges that had enriched Kushite civilization for centuries continued, but they now occurred within contexts that were often less favorable to Kushite interests and identity. The flow of ideas, technologies, and artistic influences that had previously enhanced Kushite capabilities sometimes introduced elements that challenged traditional values and practices without providing clear benefits that justified the cultural disruption. The military alliances that had provided security and strategic advantages during previous periods became less reliable as former allies pursued their own interests in changing regional circumstances. The mutual defense arrangements that had deterred potential aggressors lost effectiveness as the balance of military power shifted in ways that reduced Kushite leverage and increased their vulnerability to external threats. The economic diversification that had strengthened the kingdom during prosperous periods proved insufficient to address the multiple challenges that emerged simultaneously during this period of transition. The agricultural productivity that had supported urban populations faced environmental pressures that reduced yields, while demographic changes increased demand. The manufacturing capabilities that had generated export income encountered competition that eroded market share and profitability. The transportation infrastructure that had facilitated internal communication and external commerce required maintenance and upgrading that strained available resources, while competing priorities demanded attention. The roads, bridges, and harbour facilities that had supported centuries of prosperity needed constant repair and improvement to remain functional, but the resources necessary for such projects were increasingly difficult to allocate. The water management systems that had enabled agricultural productivity and urban growth faced environmental challenges that threatened their continued effectiveness. The irrigation networks that had channeled Nile waters to productive uses required constant maintenance, while changing river conditions and precipitation patterns created new demands on engineering capabilities and financial resources. Here at Obscure Historiesa, we recognize that this period of challenge and transformation in Kushite history reveals both the remarkable resilience of the civilization and the limitations that even the most sophisticated societies face when confronting multiple simultaneous pressures. The responses that Kushite leaders developed during this critical period demonstrate the political wisdom and cultural flexibility that had enabled their ancestors to overcome previous challenges. The social innovations that emerged during this period reflected the continued creativity and adaptability of Kushite society. Communities developed new forms of organization and mutual support that helped them cope with economic uncertainties while maintaining cultural continuity. The voluntary associations, craft guilds, and religious brotherhoods that flourished during this period provided social services and community solidarity that supplemented traditional governmental and family support systems. The artistic traditions that continued despite economic pressures demonstrated the deep cultural commitments that sustained Kushite identity even during difficult times. Craftsmen and artists adapted their techniques and subjects to changed circumstances while maintaining the aesthetic standards and cultural significance that had distinguished Kushite creative expression. The works produced during this period often reflected themes of resilience, adaptation, and hope that resonated with communities facing unprecedented challenges. The intellectual developments that occurred within religious and educational institutions during this period contributed to theological and philosophical innovations that influenced thought throughout the region. Kushite scholars grappled with questions about how traditional wisdom could be applied to contemporary problems while exploring new ideas that might provide solutions to emerging challenges. The agricultural innovations that were developed in response to environmental pressures demonstrated the practical knowledge and experimental attitude that had always characterized Kushite approaches to technological challenges. Farmers and agricultural specialists developed new crops, cultivation techniques, and land management practices that helped maintain food production despite changing conditions. The commercial adaptations that Kushite merchants developed in response to changing market conditions revealed the entrepreneurial flexibility that had sustained the kingdom's prosperity for centuries. New products, trading relationships, and business methods were explored as traditional approaches became less effective, demonstrating the continued vitality of Kushite commercial culture. The military reforms that were implemented during this period combined traditional Kushite martial strengths with tactical innovations borrowed from successful contemporary armies. The integration of new weapons, organizational methods, and strategic concepts with established military traditions created armed forces that remained capable of defending the kingdom while adapting to changing warfare requirements. The legal developments that addressed new social and economic conditions demonstrated the continued vitality of Kushite jurisprudence and its capacity to evolve in response to changing circumstances. New laws and legal procedures were developed to address problems that had not existed during previous periods, while maintaining the fundamental principles of justice and social order that had sustained Kushite civilization. The urban planning initiatives that were undertaken to address changing demographic and economic conditions reflected sophisticated understanding of the relationships between built environments and social functioning. New districts were developed to accommodate changing population patterns, while existing areas were modified to serve new purposes and meet contemporary requirements. The technological developments that emerged from Kushite workshops and laboratories during this period often focused on practical solutions to immediate problems rather than the luxury goods and artistic objects that had characterized earlier periods. These innovations demonstrated the continued technical capabilities of Kushite craftsmen, while revealing their ability to adapt their skills to address contemporary needs. The religious developments that occurred during this period reflected both the diversity of spiritual expression within Kushite society and the continued search for meaning and guidance that characterized communities facing uncertain futures. New forms of worship, theological interpretation, and religious organization emerged that addressed contemporary spiritual needs while maintaining connections to traditional beliefs and practices. The educational reforms that were implemented during this period adapted traditional curricula and methods to address contemporary requirements, while preserving the cultural knowledge and intellectual traditions that had sustained Kushite civilization. New subjects were introduced while traditional disciplines were modified to remain relevant to changing circumstances. The diplomatic initiatives that were undertaken during this period revealed the continued sophistication of Kushite international relations and the persistent efforts of kingdom leadership to maintain beneficial connections with regional powers. New alliance structures and treaty arrangements were explored that might provide security and economic advantages despite changing regional political dynamics. The cultural preservation efforts that were undertaken during this period demonstrated the deep commitment of Kushite communities to maintaining their distinctive identity despite pressures toward assimilation or abandonment of traditional practices. Libraries, schools, and religious institutions worked to preserve texts, traditions, and knowledge that might otherwise have been lost during this period of transition. The architectural adaptations that were made to existing structures during this period reflected both practical necessities and continued aesthetic sensibilities. Buildings were modified to serve new purposes or accommodate changing uses, while maintaining the architectural integrity and cultural significance that had made them important symbols of Kushite achievement. The festival traditions that continued during this period provided community celebration and cultural reinforcement that helped maintain social cohesion despite economic and political pressures. These events served both entertainment and educational purposes while strengthening the cultural bonds that enabled communities to work together effectively in addressing contemporary challenges. The craft traditions that persisted during this period often focused on practical goods rather than luxury items, but they maintained the technical excellence and aesthetic sensitivity that had always distinguished Kushite craftsmanship. These traditions provided both economic opportunities and cultural continuity that helped communities maintain their identity and capabilities. The trade relationships that were maintained or developed during this period often required greater flexibility and innovation than had been necessary during more prosperous times. Kushite merchants explored new markets, developed new products, and adapted their business methods to changing conditions while maintaining the reputation for reliability and quality that had sustained their commercial success. The military service traditions that continued during this period provided both defensive capabilities and economic opportunities for young men who might otherwise have faced limited prospects. The continued respect for Kushite military skills created opportunities for service in foreign armies, while maintaining the warrior traditions that had always been central to Kushite cultural identity. The scholarly exchanges that continued during this period maintained intellectual connections with centers of learning throughout the region, while contributing Kushite perspectives to broader discussions of contemporary problems and solutions. These exchanges helped preserve Kushite intellectual traditions, while ensuring that the kingdom remained connected to developing currents of thought and knowledge. The artistic patronage that continued during this period, albeit at reduced levels, demonstrated the persistent commitment of Kushite communities to cultural expression and aesthetic achievement. While the scale of artistic projects was often smaller than during the Golden Age, the quality and cultural significance of the works produced maintained the standards that had distinguished Kushite artistic traditions. The religious pilgrimage that continued during this period provided both spiritual fulfillment and economic opportunities for communities along traditional routes. These journeys maintained connections between different regions of the kingdom, while providing income for communities that might otherwise have faced economic hardship during this challenging period. The agricultural cooperation that developed during this period helped farming communities pool resources and share knowledge in addressing environmental challenges that were too large for individual families or villages to handle alone. These cooperative arrangements demonstrated the social solidarity that had always characterized Kushite rural communities, while adapting traditional practices to contemporary requirements. The commercial guilds that formed during this period provided organizational structures that helped merchants and craftsmen maintain professional standards while adapting to changing market conditions. These guilds served both economic and social functions while preserving traditional knowledge and practices that might otherwise have been lost during this period of transition. The legal advocacy that developed during this period helped individuals and communities navigate increasingly complex legal and administrative systems while maintaining access to justice and fair treatment. These advocacy services reflected the continued vitality of Kushite legal traditions, while addressing new types of problems that emerged during this challenging period. The medical practices that continued during this period combined traditional healing knowledge with new techniques and remedies that were developed to address health problems that emerged during times of social and economic stress. These medical traditions provided essential services while preserving knowledge that had accumulated over centuries of Kushite civilization. The transportation services that were maintained during this period ensured that communication and commerce could continue despite reduced resources and changing route priorities. These services required constant adaptation to changing conditions while maintaining the connections that were essential for political unity and economic survival. The construction techniques that were adapted during this period focused on efficiency and durability rather than the monumental scale that had characterized earlier building projects. These techniques maintained the engineering capabilities that had distinguished Kushite architecture while addressing contemporary needs with available resources. The water management practices that were modified during this period addressed changing environmental conditions while maintaining the agricultural productivity that was essential for feeding urban and rural populations. These practices demonstrated the continued technical expertise that had enabled Kushite civilization to thrive in challenging environments for centuries. The military training programs that continued during this period maintained the warrior traditions that had always been central to Kushite culture, while adapting to new tactical requirements and strategic challenges. These programs ensured that defensive capabilities remained effective, while providing young people with skills and discipline that served them throughout their lives. As this critical period in Kushite history drew toward its conclusion, the cumulative effects of environmental, political, economic, and social pressures created conditions that would ultimately transform the character of the civilization beyond recognition. The kingdom that had once ruled Egypt resisted Rome and created some of Africa's most magnificent monuments would face challenges that would test every aspect of the adaptability and resilience that had sustained it through previous crises. The legacy of this remarkable civilization would not disappear entirely, but would be preserved and transmitted through the communities, traditions, and institutions that had been shaped by centuries of Kushite achievement. The influence of Kushite political innovations, technological developments, artistic traditions, and cultural values would continue to shape African civilization long after the kingdom itself had ceased to exist as an independent political entity. The final chapters of Kushite independence would reveal both the limitations that constrain even the most successful civilizations and the enduring importance of the cultural achievements that survive political transformation. The story of the Kushites stands as testimony to the remarkable potential of human societies to create lasting beauty, wisdom, and meaning, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges and inevitable change. The decline of the Kingdom of Kush was not a sudden catastrophe, but rather a gradual erosion that unfolded across several centuries as multiple pressures converged to overwhelm even the remarkable adaptability that had sustained this civilization through previous challenges. By the 6th century CE, the kingdom that had once conquered Egypt and defied Rome found itself increasingly marginalized by forces beyond its control. Yet the dignity and sophistication with which Kushite society faced these final trials revealed the enduring strength of the cultural foundations that had been built over more than a millennium of achievement. The rise of the Aksumite Empire in the Ethiopian highlands fundamentally altered the balance of power in northeastern Africa, creating a rival that possessed advantages the Kushites could not easily match. Aksum controlled vital Red Sea ports that gave them direct access to Byzantine and Indian Ocean trade networks, bypassing the traditional Nile Valley routes that had been central to Kushite prosperity for centuries. The Aksumites also embraced Christianity earlier and more completely than their Kushite neighbors, creating religious and diplomatic connections with the Byzantine Empire that provided both commercial privileges and military support when conflicts arose. The competition between Kush and Aksum for control of regional trade networks revealed the changing dynamics that were reshaping the ancient world. While the Kushites possessed superior metallurgical skills and maintained their legendary military prowess, the Aksumites enjoyed geographic advantages and international connections that gradually shifted commercial flows away from traditional Kushite territories. The wealth that had once flowed through Meroitic cities began to enrich Aksumite merchants instead, creating a steady drain on the resources that had sustained Kushite civilization. The environmental changes that affected the Nile Valley during this period compounded these economic pressures by reducing the agricultural productivity that had supported urban populations and export industries. Shifting precipitation patterns, changing river flows, and soil degradation combined to create farming conditions that were significantly more challenging than those that had prevailed during the kingdom's golden age. The irrigation systems that had channeled life-giving waters to productive fields required constant maintenance and upgrading that strained available resources, while competing demands diverted attention from agricultural infrastructure. The social tensions that emerged from these combined pressures tested the unity and cohesion that had enabled Kushite society to function effectively through previous periods of difficulty. Urban populations that had grown accustomed to prosperity found themselves facing reduced opportunities and declining living standards, while rural communities struggled with environmental challenges that threatened traditional farming practices. The voluntary associations and mutual support networks that had emerged during earlier periods of stress provided some assistance, but they could not fully compensate for the magnitude of the problems facing the kingdom. The political fragmentation that accompanied these social and economic disruptions revealed the limitations of governmental institutions that had been designed for more stable and prosperous conditions. Regional governors who had once served as effective representatives of royal authority began to act more independently as central control weakened and local problems demanded immediate attention. The delicate balance between central coordination and regional autonomy that had characterized successful Kushite governance became increasingly difficult to maintain as resources diminished and challenges multiplied. The military pressures that intensified during this period created additional strain on a kingdom that was already struggling with multiple internal challenges. Nomadic groups from the surrounding deserts, emboldened by Kushite weakness and attracted by the wealth that still remained within the kingdom's borders, launched increasingly bold raids that disrupted trade routes and threatened agricultural communities. The Aksamites, seeking to eliminate their primary rival for regional dominance, conducted military campaigns that captured key Kushite territories and further reduced the kingdom's ability to maintain its independence. The religious developments that continued throughout this period of decline reflected both the spiritual resilience of Kushite communities and their efforts to find meaning and hope in increasingly difficult circumstances. Christian communities that had embraced the new faith found comfort in theological teachings about perseverance through suffering, while traditional religious practitioners turned to ancient rituals and beliefs that had sustained their ancestors through previous crises. The synthesis of Christian and traditional elements that had characterized Meroitic religious life during more prosperous periods continued to evolve as communities sought spiritual resources to address contemporary challenges. The architectural projects that were undertaken during this final period of independence often focused on defensive rather than ceremonial purposes, reflecting the changed priorities that governed resource allocation. Fortifications were strengthened and expanded to protect remaining population centers, while maintenance of existing monuments became increasingly difficult as skilled craftsmen were diverted to more pressing needs. The pyramid construction that had continued for centuries finally ceased entirely as royal resources were redirected towards survival rather than symbolic expression of power and cultural achievement. The cultural preservation efforts that intensified during this period demonstrated the deep commitment of Kushite communities to maintaining their distinctive identity despite overwhelming pressures toward assimilation or abandonment of traditional practices. Scribes worked to copy and preserve manuscripts that contained essential knowledge about history, religion, law, and technical subjects, while teachers struggled to maintain educational institutions that could transmit cultural knowledge to younger generations. These preservation activities often occurred in monasteries and religious schools that provided some protection from the political and military turmoil affecting secular institutions. The commercial adaptations that Kushite merchants developed during this period revealed the continued entrepreneurial spirit that had sustained the kingdom's prosperity for centuries, even as traditional markets and trading relationships became increasingly unreliable. New products were developed that could be produced with available resources and transported along routes that remained accessible, while business methods were modified to address the increased risks and reduced profitability that characterized commerce during this turbulent period. The diplomatic initiatives that were undertaken during the kingdom's final decades reflected both the political sophistication of Kushite leadership and their persistent efforts to find solutions to seemingly intractable problems. Negotiations with Aksamite rulers sought to establish peaceful coexistence and mutually beneficial trade relationships, while appeals to Byzantine authorities attempted to secure protection and support based on shared Christian identity. These diplomatic efforts demonstrated the continued vitality of Kushite political culture, even as the kingdom's military and economic power waned. The artistic traditions that persisted during this challenging period often focused on portable objects and small-scale works that could be completed with limited resources, while maintaining the aesthetic standards that had distinguished Kushite craftsmanship throughout its history. Jewelry, textiles, and decorative objects continued to be produced by artisans who adapted their techniques to available materials, while preserving the cultural symbols and motifs that had expressed Kushite identity for generations. Here at Obscure Historiesa, we find ourselves deeply moved by the dignity and grace with which Kushite civilization faced its final trials. The responses that communities developed to address unprecedented challenges revealed character traits and cultural values that had sustained this remarkable society through more than a millennium of achievement and adaptation. Even as political independence became increasingly difficult to maintain, the essential elements of Kushite culture continued to flourish in forms that would influence African civilization for centuries to come. The educational innovations that were developed during this period often emphasized practical skills and knowledge that would help individuals and communities survive in changed circumstances, while preserving cultural literacy and intellectual traditions that defined Kushite identity. Schools adapted their curricula to focus on subjects that would be most useful for students facing uncertain futures, while still maintaining instruction in history, literature, and religious studies that connected students to their cultural heritage. The agricultural experiments that were conducted during this period combined traditional farming knowledge with innovative techniques that might help communities maintain food production despite environmental challenges. New crops were tested that might prove more resilient to changing conditions, while traditional varieties were selectively bred to enhance their adaptability to contemporary requirements. These agricultural innovations demonstrated the practical knowledge and experimental attitude that had characterized Kushite approaches to technological challenges throughout their history. The medical practices that evolved during this period combined traditional healing knowledge with new treatments that were developed to address health problems that emerged during times of social stress and economic hardship. Healers worked to maintain the knowledge systems that had been developed over centuries while adapting their practices to address contemporary needs with available resources. The reputation of Kushite medical practitioners continued to attract patients from neighboring regions, providing both income and cultural influence that helped maintain the kingdom's regional connections. The military reforms that were implemented during this period combined traditional Kushite martial strengths with tactical innovations that addressed the changing nature of regional warfare. While the legendary archery skills that had made Kushite warriors feared throughout the ancient world remained central to military doctrine, new weapons and organizational methods were incorporated to address the challenges posed by better equipped and more numerous enemies. The training programs that prepared young men for military service continued to emphasize the discipline and courage that had always characterized Kushite warrior culture. The technological developments that emerged from workshops and laboratories during this period often focused on practical solutions to immediate problems, rather than the luxury goods and artistic objects that had characterized earlier periods of prosperity. Innovations in metallurgy, engineering, and craftsmanship were directed toward producing tools, weapons, and equipment that would help communities function effectively, despite reduced resources and increased challenges. The transportation systems that were maintained during this period required constant adaptation to changing political and military conditions while preserving the connections that were essential for communication and commerce. Routes were modified to avoid areas of conflict or instability, while new paths were developed that might provide safer passage for travelers and merchants. The engineering skills that had created and maintained these transportation networks for centuries continued to serve communities that depended on mobility for their survival and prosperity. The water management practices that were adapted during this period addressed environmental challenges, while maintaining the agricultural and urban water supplies that were essential for community survival. Ancient irrigation systems were modified to function with reduced water flows, while new techniques were developed for conserving and distributing available water resources more efficiently. These innovations demonstrated the continued technical expertise that had enabled Kushite communities to thrive in challenging environments throughout their history. The legal systems that continued to function during this period adapted to address new types of problems and disputes that emerged from changing social and economic conditions. Courts and legal procedures were modified to remain accessible and effective despite reduced resources and increased complexity of cases, while fundamental principles of justice and social order were preserved to maintain community stability. The legal traditions that had developed over centuries of Kushite civilization continued to provide frameworks for resolving conflicts and maintaining social cohesion. The religious institutions that served communities during this period provided not only spiritual guidance, but also practical assistance and social services that helped individuals and families cope with unprecedented challenges. Monasteries and churches became centers of education, healthcare, and charitable assistance that supplemented traditional governmental and family support systems. The religious leaders who guided these institutions combined theological knowledge with practical wisdom that addressed both spiritual and material needs of their communities. The festival traditions that continued during this period provided community celebration and cultural reinforcement that helped maintain social bonds and cultural identity despite economic and political pressures. These events served multiple purposes by providing entertainment, education, and social interaction that strengthened the cultural foundations that enabled communities to work together effectively in addressing contemporary challenges. The craft guilds that functioned during this period provided organizational structures that helped artisans maintain professional standards while adapting to changing market conditions and resource availability. These guilds served both economic and social functions by preserving traditional knowledge and practices while facilitating innovation and adaptation that enabled craftsmen to continue producing goods that met contemporary needs and preferences. The commercial associations that were formed during this period helped merchants pool resources and share risks, while maintaining trading relationships that might otherwise have become unprofitable or too dangerous to pursue individually. These associations provided mutual support and collective bargaining power that enabled Kushite merchants to compete more effectively with rivals who possessed superior resources or political connections. The scholarly networks that continued to function during this period maintained intellectual connections with centers of learning throughout the region, while contributing Kushite perspectives to broader discussions of contemporary problems and solutions. These networks helped preserve Kushite intellectual traditions, while ensuring that the kingdom's scholars remained connected to developing currents of thought and knowledge that might provide insights relevant to contemporary challenges. The artistic patronage that persisted during this period, albeit at much reduced levels, demonstrated the continued commitment of Kushite communities to cultural expression and aesthetic achievement. While the scale and elaborateness of artistic projects was necessarily limited by available resources, the quality and cultural significance of works produced maintained the standards that had distinguished Kushite artistic traditions throughout their history. The marriage and family practices that evolved during this period adapted to changed social and economic conditions while preserving the cultural values and social structures that had sustained Kushite communities for generations. New arrangements were developed that helped families cope with economic uncertainty while maintaining the support systems and cultural transmission that ensured continuity of traditions and knowledge. The burial customs that continued during this period reflected both changing circumstances and enduring cultural values regarding proper treatment of the deceased and maintenance of connections between living and dead community members. While the elaborate tomb construction that had characterized earlier periods became impractical, the essential elements of mortuary practice were preserved through adaptations that honored the deceased while recognizing resource limitations. The seasonal celebrations that marked agricultural and social cycles continued to provide community structure and cultural continuity despite the disruptions that affected other aspects of social life. These celebrations maintained connections to natural rhythms and traditional practices, while adapting to contemporary circumstances and available resources. The coming-of-age ceremonies that initiated young people into adult community membership continued to function as important social institutions that transmitted cultural knowledge while preparing individuals for the responsibilities and opportunities they would face as adults. These ceremonies were adapted to address contemporary challenges while preserving the essential elements that connected young people to their cultural heritage and community identity. The storytelling traditions that preserved historical knowledge and cultural wisdom continued to serve important educational and entertainment functions while adapting to contemporary interests and concerns. The stories that were told during this period often emphasized themes of resilience, adaptation, and hope that resonated with communities facing unprecedented challenges, while maintaining connections to the cultural heritage that defined Kushite identity. The musical traditions that accompanied religious ceremonies and social gatherings continued to provide emotional expression and community bonding that helped individuals and groups cope with stress and uncertainty. These musical practices preserved traditional forms while incorporating new elements that reflected contemporary experiences and cultural influences. The dance traditions that were part of religious and social celebrations continued to provide physical expression and community participation that strengthened social bonds while maintaining cultural practices that had been passed down through generations. These dance forms preserved traditional elements while adapting to contemporary circumstances and cultural changes. The textile production that continued during this period focused on practical clothing and household goods rather than the luxury fabrics that had been produced during more prosperous times. However, the technical skills and aesthetic sensibilities that had distinguished Kushite textile work continued to be evident in the products that were created, maintaining cultural standards while addressing contemporary needs. The food preparation and culinary traditions that evolved during this period adapted to available ingredients and resources while preserving the cultural elements that defined Kushite cuisine. New recipes and cooking methods were developed that made the most of available foods while maintaining the nutritional and cultural functions that meals served in community life. The childcare and education practices that were maintained during this period ensured that cultural knowledge and social skills were transmitted to younger generations, despite the disruptions that affected formal educational institutions. Parents, extended families, and community members worked together to provide the guidance and instruction that children needed to become productive and culturally literate adults. The elderly care practices that continued during this period reflected the cultural values regarding respect for age and wisdom while adapting to changed economic circumstances and family structures. Communities developed new arrangements for ensuring that older members received the care and support they needed while contributing their knowledge and experience to community welfare. The story of the Kushites stands as one of history's most remarkable testaments to human achievement, resilience, and the enduring power of cultural innovation. From their origins in the harsh landscapes of Nubia to their conquest of Egypt, from their golden age in Meroe to their gradual transformation in the face of a changing world, the Kushites demonstrated that greatness can emerge from any corner of the earth when vision, adaptability, and determination converge. Their legacy challenges us to reconsider our understanding of ancient Africa and reminds us that the most extraordinary civilizations are often those whose stories have yet to be fully told. Here at Obscure Histories, we believe their remarkable journey deserves to be remembered alongside the greatest powers that ever shaped our world.